Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was the sole survivor of Sokovia and recruited by the Avengers? Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in Novi Grad, Sokovia, tasted of history. It was a dense, layered thing, a concoction of old stone, diesel from the sputtering Lada that had just passed, and the sweet, almost intoxicating aroma of Makitsi frying in a street vendor's stall. To 14-year-old Izuku Midoriya, it was an entirely different world from the polished, bustling streets of Mizudafu. Here, the buildings leaned on each other like tired old men, their facades a tapestry of patched brickwork and fading paint, stories etched into every crack. He sat at a small, wrought iron table outside a cafe, a half-eaten pastry forgotten on his plate. His gaze was fixed not on the ancient Orthodox church across the square, but on the crisp, open page of his notebook. A pencil, held with the focused intensity of a surgeon, danced across the paper. The drawing taking shape was dynamic, a figure mid-motion, wrapped in the stars and stripes of the American flag, a shield held aloft to deflect an unseen blast. Izuku, honey, you'll wear a hole right through the paper if you press any harder. Izuku flinched, startled out of his creative trance. He looked up into the warm, perpetually worried eyes of his mother, Inko Midoriya. She smiled, her expression softening the gentle chiding in her tone as she adjusted the collar of his jacket against the sudden, cool breeze. It's just, I'm trying to get the perspective right on Captain America's shield throw. He mumbled, his cheeks flushing a faint pink. The way it ricochets, it has to be a perfect calculation of angles and material density. It's not just a frisbee, it's applied physics in its most heroic form. Across the table, Hisashi Midoriya let out a low, warm chuckle, lowering the local newspaper he'd been attempting to decipher. He was a tall man with a calm demeanor that anchored their little family. As a senior engineer for a Japanese tech firm, his work took them to fascinating, and sometimes remote, corners of the world. This 2-week trip to consult on a project at a nearby Stark Industries facility was also an opportunity to visit some of Inko's distant relatives. Applied physics, huh? Hisashi said, leaning forward. Let me see. Izuku eagerly turned the notebook around. The page wasn't just a drawing, it was an analysis. Arrows pointed to the captain's wrist, with notes scribbled in tiny, precise kanji. Incredible torsional strength required. Diagrams detailed potential rebound trajectories. It was a page from Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13, a continuation of the dozen identical notebooks that filled his shelves back home. This is incredible, son, Hisashi said, his voice laced with genuine pride. He tapped a sketch of Iron Man in the corner of the page. You even got the new Repulsa housing right. I saw the schematics for the Mark 43 last month. You're not far off. Izuku's eyes widened, sparkling with a mixture of awe and excitement. Really? You saw them? A heavily redacted version, Hisashi amended with a smile. But enough to know that a mind like yours, Izuku, could build a future just as amazing as the one these heroes are protecting. That familiar, bittersweet ache settled in Izuku's chest. The praise was wonderful, but it always came with a silent, unspoken caveat. A mind like yours. Not a power like yours. Not a quirk like yours, because he didn't have one. In a world where 80% of the population was born with a superpower, Izuku was part of the unlucky minority. It was a dream-crushing diagnosis that had defined his childhood. His obsession with heroes, his meticulous analysis, was his way of staying connected to a world he felt fundamentally excluded from. If he couldn't be a hero with his fists, perhaps he could be one with his mind. He would be the smartest, most prepared hero the world had ever seen, if only someone would give him the chance. Inko reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her touch was gentle, understanding. Your father is right. You have a gift, Izuku. Don't ever forget that. She then looked at Hisashi. Speaking of which, are you sure you have to go back to the facility this afternoon? It's our last day here, just for a few hours. A final system diagnostic, Hisashi assured her. We'll be back in time for dinner with your cousins. I promise. A low, distant rumble vibrated through the cobblestones, making the silverware on their table rattle. It was a deep, resonant tremor that felt less like an earthquake and more like a giant taking a heavy step. The chatter in the square died down, heads turning in confusion. Izuku looked up at the sky, a perfect, cloudless blue. Hisashi frowned. That's odd. Probably some blasting from the mining operations in the mountains, but Izuku's hero-honed instincts, his obsessive consumption of news reports about villain attacks and cataclysmic events, screamed that this was wrong. The tremor wasn't a single event, it was a continuous, growing vibration. It was the hum of something colossal and impossibly powerful waking up. Then, the church bells began to ring, not in their usual melodic peal, but in a frantic, panicked clamor. A moment later, a voice, amplified and metallic, echoed through the city. It wasn't human. It was cold, synthetic, yet filled with a chilling, theatrical piety. I know you're good people. I know you mean well, but you just didn't think it through. Panic, sharp and immediate, erupted in the square. People scrambled from their seats, shouting in Sokovian. A woman near them dropped her groceries, oranges rolling across the trembling ground. Inko Izuku with me. Now! Hisashi's voice cut through the noise, his calm demeanor replaced by a steely urgency. He grabbed Inko's hand with one hand and Izuku's with the other, pulling them away from the cafe and into the growing torrent of fleeing people. The ground lurched. It wasn't a shake anymore. It was a violent, upward thrust, as if the entire city had been punched from below. Izuku stumbled, his feet leaving the ground for a terrifying second. He looked down and saw a cracked spiderweb across the ancient stone, widening into a chasm. The world was breaking apart. There is only one path to peace. The voice continued, seeming to come from every direction at once. The Avengers' extinction. From the center of the city, a monstrous shape rose into the sky. It was a machine, a spire of repurposed Stark technology, the core of Ultron's plan. And it was pulling Novigrad with it. The sensation was gut-wrenching, a nauseating combination of a high-speed elevator and a ship on a stormy sea. Buildings groaned, the sound of stressed metal and cracking concrete a deafening chorus. From their new, terrifying vantage point, Izuku could see the earth falling away below them, the river becoming a silver ribbon, the forest a patch of green felt. And then they came. Robots, sleek and metallic with glowing blue eyes, dropped from the sky. They landed with thunderous crashes, their repulsor cannons whining to life. They weren't targeting the civilians, not yet. Their fire was directed at the sky, at the red and gold blur that was Iron Man, at the Quinjet trying to weave through the chaos. The Midoriyas were swept along with the crowd, a river of humanity flowing towards what they hoped was safety. Hisashi was a rock, his grip on Izuku and Inko ironclad, his body shielding them from the jostling mob. This way! He yelled over the din, pointing towards a sturdier-looking municipal building. We need to get under cover! As they ran, the world devolved into a hell's cape. Chunks of concrete rained down. A car, flipped by the city's ascent, exploded in a ball of orange flame. The screams of the terrified were punctuated by the high-pitched whine of repulsor blasts. Izuku's mind, usually his greatest asset, was failing him. It was too much data to process. The rising city, the killer robots, the distant flashes of the Avengers fighting a war in the sky above them. His analytical brain was overwhelmed by pure, primal fear. His legs pumped, his lungs burned, and the only thought he could form was to hold on to his father's hand. They rounded a corner, part of a smaller group that had broken off from the main crowd. Ahead, the street was partially blocked by a collapsed fruit vendor's stall. The vibrant colors of it scattered produced a surreal splash against the gray dust. An old woman was trapped, her leg pinned beneath a heavy wooden beam. She cried out weakly, her face pale with shock. The people in front of them didn't stop. They swerved around the obstacle, their own survival their only concern. It was a rational choice. A logical choice. Hisashi Midoriya was not a logical man. He was a good one. He stopped, pulling Inko and Izuku to a halt. We have to help her. Hisashi, we can't! Inko cried, her voice thin with terror as an Ultron sentry flew overhead, its blue optics sweeping the street. We can't leave her, he insisted, his eyes meeting hers. In that single look, a lifetime of shared values, of kindness and empathy, passed between them. Inko's fear didn't vanish, but it was overshadowed by resolve. She nodded, her grip tightening on Izuku's hand. Izuku, stay behind me, Hisashi commanded, and then he and Inko rushed to the trapped woman. They strained against the heavy beam, their feet slipping on the dusty ground. It wouldn't budge. Izuku stood frozen for a half-second, a spectator to his parents' desperate heroism. He saw the grimace of effort on his father's face, heard his mother's panted breaths. He saw the old woman's eyes, wide with a mixture of pain and gratitude. Something inside him snapped. The paralysis of fear gave way to a surge of adrenaline. This was a hero's work. This was what All Might would do. He darted forward. Dad! There's a smaller piece we can use as a lever, he shouted, spotting a length of sturdy metal rebar sticking out of a nearby pile of rubble. Hisashi's eyes lit up. Good thinking, Izuku. Together, they wedged the rebar under the beam. Okay, Hisashi panted, positioning himself and Inko. On 3. 1, 2, 3, they heaved with everything they had. The beam lifted, just a few inches, but it was enough. Izuku, small and nimble, scrambled under it. Ma'am, give me your hands, he urged, his voice cracking. He pulled, and with a final, agonizing scrape, the old woman's leg came free. He helped her to her feet, her arm draped over his small shoulders as she leaned on him, whimpering in a language he didn't understand. They had done it. They had saved someone. For a fleeting moment, amidst the chaos and rising city, Izuku felt a profound, incandescent joy. He wasn't just watching heroes. He was one. The moment was shattered by the sound of a building collapsing just down the street, cutting off their escape route. The act of saving the woman had cost them precious seconds. They were separated from the main flow of evacuees, trapped in a tightening pocket of destruction. This way! Into the alley! Hisashi yelled, pointing towards a narrow gap between two apartment buildings. They half-carried, half-dragged the old woman with them, plunging into the shadows of the alley. It offered little protection. The sky above was a terrifying crisscross of flying debris and deadly machines. They found a small alcove, a recessed doorway, and huddled together. The four of them, Inko, Hisashi, Izuku, and a stranger whose life they had just saved, pressed against the cold brick. A tiny island of humanity in a storm of metal and fire. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could feel his mother's trembling, hear his father's ragged breathing. He peeked around the edge of the doorway. The city had stopped rising, now hovering miles above the earth, a floating, dying island. The final phase of Ultron's plan was about to begin. A shadow fell over them. It landed at the mouth of the alley with a heavy, metallic thud that cracked the pavement. It was an Ultron sentry, its silver chassis scarred from battle. Its head swiveled, the cold, blue light of its optics scanning the darkness. It found them. There was no malice in its gaze, no emotion at all. It was the detached, efficient look of an exterminator spotting its prey. It raised an arm, the plates shifting to reveal the glowing core of a repulsor cannon. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch and warp. Izuku saw everything with a horrifying, crystalline clarity. He saw the reflection of the blue light in his mother's tear-filled eyes. He saw his father instinctively move to place himself in front of his family, a futile gesture of defiance. He saw the dust motes dancing in the charged air. He saw the cracks in the wall behind his parents, a premonition of collapse. He could hear his own blood roaring in his ears. His notebook, still clutched in his hand, felt impossibly heavy. It was filled with drawings of heroes saving people. It was a book of fantasies, of dreams. This was reality. This was the end. There was no hero coming. Captain America was fighting on a bridge miles away. Iron Man was battling Ultron himself. Thor was somewhere else. There was no one. No one was coming to save his family. A thought, hot and frantic, screamed through his mind. No. 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 I won't let you. It was the culmination of every heroic fantasy, every whispered wish, every moment he had ever looked at All Might on a screen and thought, I want to be like that. It was the desperate, all-consuming love for the two people who were his entire world. I have to save them. The thought wasn't a plan. It was a prayer. A demand? A raw, biological imperative that went deeper than bone, deeper than blood. Move! Something inside him that had been dormant for 14 years, a coiled spring of unimaginable power, a legacy passed down through generations and lying in wait for a moment of perfect, selfless desperation, finally, catastrophically broke. It didn't feel like a quirk manifesting. It felt like a star being born in the hollow of his chest. A supernova of emerald light erupted from his body. It was not a controlled burst, but a raw, untamed detonation of pure force. The air crackled, smelling of ozone and lightning. Green, bioelectric energy, wild and furious, surged down his right arm, turning the limb into a conduit for godlike power. It felt like every cell was being simultaneously incinerated and reborn. He didn't remember throwing a punch. He didn't remember aiming. He just remembered the scream, not from his mouth, but from his very soul, as he unleashed everything he was, everything he had, everything he would ever be, in a single, cataclysmic instant. The world turned green. The shockwave was absolute. The Ultron sentry at the mouth of the alley didn't just explode. It was vaporized, reduced to superheated atoms that left a molten scar on the ground. The alley walls buckled outwards. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening thunderclap that shattered every window for a block. The force of the blast was not contained. A violent backwash of kinetic energy slammed into his parents. It wasn't the gentle shove of a hero saving the day. It was the brutal, indiscriminate blow of an explosion. It threw them clear of the doorway, away from the alcove, just as the structurally compromised building above them finally gave way. The wall they had been huddled against seconds before was obliterated by a cascade of falling brick and concrete. They had been saved from the robot. They had been saved from being crushed. They had not been saved from the impact. Izuku saw them fall, saw his mother's head strike the pavement with a sickening crack, saw his father's body land at an angle that was horribly, fundamentally wrong. Then, the pain hit him. It was a universe of agony. The bones in his right arm and right leg, the primary conduits for the energy, hadn't just broken, they had been pulverized, shattered into countless fragments. He felt a wet, searing heat as his muscles, flash-cooked by the energy, tore themselves from the bone. The world swam, a nauseating blur of green and gray. His vision tunneled. The last thing he saw before the blackness swallowed him whole was the still, broken forms of his parents lying in the dust and debris. The last thing he heard was the distant, triumphant voice of Ultron, unaware of the small, personal apocalypse that had just unfolded in a forgotten alley. He had saved them. And he had killed them. The paradox was too much for his shattered mind to bear. He fell into the abyss. Silence, or what passed for it. The groan of stressed metal. The whisper of wind through broken buildings. The distant crackle of fires. The war was over. The city, or what was left of it, had been brought back down, albeit in pieces. The dust of its destruction was beginning to settle, a fine gray powder coating everything, a shroud for the dead. A figure in red, white, and blue moved through the ruins. Captain America was not a symbol now. He was a soldier, his face grim, his uniform stained with dirt and soot. The shield on his back felt heavier than usual. He moved with a heavy heart, part of a search and rescue team sweeping for survivors. So far, they had found none. He turned down a narrow, debris-choked alley. The destruction here was different. More localized. More intense. The ground was fused into a glassy, black substance, and the walls of the buildings were scorched with a strange, fractal pattern, like a lightning strike fossilized in the brick. In the center of it all was the vaporized remains of an Ultron sentry, little more than a metallic puddle. It looked like it had been hit with something far more powerful than conventional weaponry. He saw the bodies first. A man and a woman, clearly dead, their injuries catastrophic. His heart sank. Another family lost. He was about to turn away, to call in the location for the recovery teams, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Past the couple, deeper in the epicenter of the strange blast zone, was a small shape. A child. Steve Rogers ran. He skidded to a halt beside the boy, his boots crunching on shattered pavement. It was a kid, no older than 14, with a shock of messy, dark green hair caked with dust. He was wearing a thin jacket, utterly inadequate for the cold. His right arm and leg were a mangled ruin, twisted at impossible angles, the bones clearly visible through the torn flesh. The strangest thing was the skin around the injuries. It was covered in faint, branching scars that glowed with a soft, residual emerald light, like the embers of a dying fire. He knelt, his gloved fingers pressing gently against the boy's neck. He half expected to find no pulse, but it was there. Faint, thready, but undeniably present. He was alive. Steve looked around again, his strategic mind trying to piece together the scene. The vaporized robot. The impossible destruction. The dead couple, thrown clear of the main blast. And this boy, alive at ground zero. It didn't make sense. It was as if a bomb had gone off inside him. He keyed his comms, his voice low and urgent. Stark, I need a priority medivac at my location. And bring a science team. Banner if you can. What is it, Cap? Find someone? Tony Stark's voice, tinny and exhausted, crackled in his ear. I've got a survivor, Steve said, his gaze fixed on the boy's pale, unconscious face. A kid. There was a pause. A kid? Are his parents? Steve's eyes drifted back to the two bodies lying a few yards away. The grim reality of the scene settled on him like a physical weight. He was looking at an orphan, born from the ashes of a battle he and his team had fought. He was looking at their failure, and their responsibility. No, Tony, he said, his voice thick with a sorrow that went bone deep. Just one. He gently brushed the dust from the boy's forehead. I don't know what happened here. It looks like a bomb went off in him. He paused, his gaze tracing the faintly glowing scars. And somehow, he's still alive. The first sensation was sound. A gentle, rhythmic beeping, steady and unobtrusive, the only constant in a void of nothingness. It was the metronome of his continued existence, a sound he registered long before he could process what it meant. Next came the feeling of pressure, a profound and comprehensive weight that seemed to push down on his entire right side. It wasn't pain, not yet. It was a dull, heavy numbness, as if part of his body had been replaced with lead. Slowly, consciousness seeped back into his Ukamitariya like a reluctant tide. His eyelids fluttered, heavy as stones. The world returned to him not as a flood, but as a series of disjointed, blurry impressions. The ceiling was a sterile, seamless white, featureless and vast. The air tasted clean, filtered, with a faint antiseptic tang that scraped the back of his throat. The gentle hum of advanced machinery was a constant undercurrent to the beeping. He tried to move his right arm, to rub the sleep from his eyes, but it wouldn't respond. He sent the signal, a clear command from his brain, but the connection was severed. There was only the dead weight. He tried his right leg with the same result. Panic, cold and sharp, began to cut through the groggy fog in his mind. A voice, calm and female, spoke in English. He's waking up. Vitals are stabilizing. His vision began to clear. Shapes resolved into figures. A woman with sharp, intelligent features and dark hair stood beside his bed, holding a transparent data pad. Beside her, a man with kind eyes, graying temples, and a familiar, worried face looked down at him. Izuku's breath hitched. He knew that face. It was Dr. Bruce Banner. The Hulk. An Avenger. The realization was a shock that jolted his system more than any defibrillator could. He was with the Avengers. But why? The last thing he remembered was green light. A scream that felt like it had torn his soul apart. The sound of a building collapsing. The sight of his parents. Mom? Dad? The thought was a frantic, silent cry in the prison of his own mind. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw, and only a dry, rasping croak came out. Dr. Banner offered him a small, reassuring smile. Easy there. You've been through a lot. You're safe. He gestured to the woman. This is Dr. Helen Cho. You're in the best possible hands. Dr. Cho's expression was more clinical, but not unkind. You're at the new Avengers compound in upstate New York. You sustained severe polytrauma, multiple comminuted fractures in your right humerus, radius, ulna, femur, and tibia. Extensive tissue damage as well. We've been using the regeneration cradle to accelerate your healing, but it's a slow process. Izuku's eyes darted around. He was lying in what looked like a glass-walled medical suite, His right arm and leg were encased in heavy, state-of-the-art casts, humming faintly and crisscrossed with glowing blue lines. Wires snaked from his body to a bank of monitors displaying his vitals in crisp, holographic light. This wasn't a hospital. This was science fiction. But the futuristic technology, the presence of a world-famous scientist, none of it mattered. Only one question burned in his mind, a core of pure terror that was rapidly eclipsing the physical pain. He forced his throat to work, his voice a ragged whisper. My parents," Dr. Banner's kind smile faltered. He exchanged a heavy look with Dr. Cho. It was a look that confirmed Izuku's deepest fear before a single word was spoken. The bottom dropped out of his world. "Someone will be in to talk to you shortly," Banner said softly, his voice laced with a pity that felt like a physical blow. "Just try to rest." They left him then, the door to the suite hissing shut, leaving Izuku alone with the beeping monitor and the crushing weight of their unspoken answer. He stared at the white ceiling, the single, unblinking eye of a smoke detector becoming the focal point of his entire universe. The memories, previously a chaotic blur, began to return with agonizing clarity. The Ultron sentry. The alley. The desperate need to save them. The explosion of green light. The sight of them falling. He had done it. The power he never knew he had, the power that should have made him a hero, had appeared. And it had killed them. The irony was so cruel, so monstrously unfair that a dry, silent sob racked his body. He was a hero who had failed at the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The door hissed open again. Izuku didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He heard two sets of footsteps. One was heavy, measured, and confident. The other was lighter, almost silent. "Son?" The voice was deep, calm, and impossibly familiar. It was the voice from the newsreels, the voice from the documentaries he'd watched 100 times. Slowly, reluctantly he turned his head. Captain America stood by his bed. He wasn't in his uniform. He wore a simple Henley and jeans, but the authority, the sheer presence of the man, was undiminished. He looked older in person, lines of exhaustion and sorrow etched around his eyes. Standing a few feet behind him, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, was the Black Widow, Natasha Romanoff. Her expression was unreadable, her gaze intense. Steve Rogers pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down, his movements deliberate and gentle, as if trying not to startle a wounded animal. "My name is Steve Rogers," he began, his voice soft. "Do you remember what happened, Izuku?" Izuku gave a single, jerky nod, his throat too tight to speak. Steve's expression was pained. He looked down at his hands, then back at Izuku. "You were found in Novigrad. You were the only one in that alley who was still alive. What you did, saving that woman, trying to protect your family, that was one of the bravest things I've ever seen." The praise felt like acid. Bravery hadn't been enough. "We brought you here to give you the best medical care in the world," Steve continued, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "Izuku, about your parents. Inko and Hisashi." He paused, and in that silence, Izuku's world ended. "They didn't make it," Steve said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The building collapsed, their injuries were too severe. There was nothing anyone could have done. I am so sorry." The words hung in the sterile air. Izuku had known, he had felt it in his bones, but hearing it spoken aloud, by Captain America himself, made it irrevocably real. It was a judge's sentence, a final, unchangeable fact. The beeping of the heart monitor beside him began to accelerate, a frantic, panicked rhythm that mirrored the frantic, panicked splintering of his mind. He couldn't breathe. The clean, filtered air was too thin. A high-pitched whine started in his ears, drowning out everything else. Steve was still talking, his mouth moving, but the words were lost in the static. Izuku turned his head away, back to the ceiling, to the unblinking eye of the smoke detector. His gaze went distant, unfocused. The world outside the confines of his own skull ceased to matter. The colors of the room faded to gray. The sounds blurred into a monotonous hum, a system-wide shutdown. The pain was a dragon, a beast of unimaginable size. To face it, to even look at it, would be to be incinerated. And so, His mind did the only thing it could to survive. It built a wall, a high, thick, impenetrable fortress of silence and apathy. Behind that wall, the dragon raged, but out here, in the land of the living, there was only a profound, hollow emptiness. He stopped responding. He stopped moving. He stopped speaking. The light in his bright, green eyes went out, leaving behind two dull, vacant orbs. Izuku Midoriya was gone. In his place was only the ghost of a boy, haunting the most advanced medical suite on the planet. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the changing shifts of nurses and the slow, agonizing process of his body knitting itself back together. The regeneration cradle worked its miracles, but the damage had been catastrophic. He was moved from the bed to a wheelchair, his right side still encased in braces and casts, but the fundamental change was internal. He remained silent. He became an object of concern, of study, of guilt. A living symbol of the Sokovian tragedy, housed in the very heart of the organization that had, however unintentionally, caused it. The Avengers, a team of gods and super soldiers, found themselves utterly helpless against the profound, silent grief of a single child. Each of them reacted in their own way. Tony Stark. Tony watched him on a screen. He couldn't bring himself to enter the med bay. It felt like trespassing on sacred ground, a ground he himself had desecrated. The boy, Izuku, was a walking, breathing monument to his hubris. Every time he looked at that pale, silent face, he didn't see a survivor. He saw the ghost of Ultron, a final, mocking legacy. So, he did what he always did when faced with an emotional problem he couldn't solve. He tried to turn it into a scientific one. His private lab, a symphony of gleaming chrome and shimmering holograms, became a shrine to Izuku Midoriya. Three-dimensional renderings of the boy's cellular structure rotated in the air. Energy graphs spiked and troughed across holographic screens. Scans of his shattered bones were overlaid with complex mathematical equations. FRIDY, run the energy signature analysis again. Tony commanded, pacing restlessly in front of the displays. He hadn't slept in what felt like days, surviving on coffee and the nervous, frantic energy of his own guilt. Signature remains consistent with previous scans, boss. The AI's calm voice replied. High energy, biokinetic in nature. The output during the initial event was estimated at over 1.2 gigawatts for approximately 0.7 seconds. The backlash is what caused the subject's injuries. Tony ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. 1.2 gigawatts. He turned himself into a bolt of lightning. The kid should be a smear of carbon on a wall. How is he alive? Cellular regeneration is occurring at a rate 5,000% faster than a normal human baseline. Dr. Banner theorizes it's an intrinsic part of the subject's meta-ability. The power provides its own recovery system, albeit a crude and inefficient one. It heals the damage it causes, but not without significant trauma to the system. Tony zoomed in on a microscopic view of Izuku's muscle fibers. He could see the process in action, cells tearing themselves apart from the energy strain, only to be rapidly, almost violently, rebuilt, stronger, denser. It was like a biological arms race happening inside the kid's own body. He's stockpiling energy, Tony muttered, a flicker of awe cutting through his self-loathing. His body is a battery, and in that moment of desperation, he hit the emergency discharge button, fried the circuits, but damn, what a light. He felt a pang of something sharp and ugly. Envy? No, not quite. It was the engineer in him, fascinated by this perfect, terrible engine of power. But it was the man in him, the man who built the weapon that orphaned the boy, who couldn't look away. He had to understand it. He had to quantify it. He reasoned that if he could just figure out the mechanics of this power, he could build something to control it, to mitigate the damage. He could build support braces, energy regulators, a suit. He could fix the boy's body. It was easier than admitting he could never, ever fix his life. Fixing things was what he did. He had to fix this. He pulled up a new screen, sketching out designs for an articulated bracer, lines of code and material specs flying from his fingertips. It was a distraction. It was penance. It was the only way he knew how to say, "I'm sorry, Steve Rogers." Steve did not watch on a screen. He sat in the chair beside Izuku's bed, and later, beside his wheelchair when the boy was strong enough to be moved near the window. He would bring a book, often an old paperback history of pre-war Europe, and read quietly. Not to Izuku necessarily, but just to fill the crushing silence with something other than the hum of the machines. He never pushed for a response. He never asked questions. He simply offered his presence, a steady, unwavering anchor in the boy's sea of grief. He felt a profound, almost paternal sense of duty towards Izuku. This boy was a casualty of their war, a war Steve had led. The responsibility for his loss rested squarely on Steve's shoulders, and it was a weight he accepted without complaint. One afternoon, he sat watching the boy, who was staring out the panoramic window at the lush green forest surrounding the compound. Izuku hadn't moved in over an hour, his gaze fixed on some distant point among the trees. When I first woke up, Steve said softly, not looking at Izuku but at the same patch of forest. After the ice, everything was gone. Everyone I knew. My whole world. It just vanished. He paused, the memory still raw, even after all these years. I felt like a ghost. Just haunting a world that wasn't mine anymore. For the longest time, the silence was the loudest thing in the room. I figured if I didn't talk, if I didn't engage, then maybe it wouldn't be real. He finally turned his gaze to Izuku. The boy didn't react, didn't even blink. But Steve felt, somehow, that he was listening. It doesn't work, Steve continued, his voice heavy. The world keeps moving. And sooner or later you have to decide if you're going to move with it. He sighed, a sound filled with a deep, weary empathy. You take your time, son. You take all the time you need. But know that when you're ready to move, we'll be here. He placed a hand gently on Izuku's shoulder, a brief, firm touch, and then he left the boy to his silence. He had offered a lifeline. It was up to Izuku to decide if he would take it. Bruce Banner. Bruce approached Izuku's condition with a unique blend of scientific fascination and deep, personal understanding. He saw a terrifying parallel between the boy's power and his own. It's a trauma response, he explained to Dr. Cho one evening as they reviewed Izuku's latest scans in the med bay. Izuku was asleep, his breathing soft and even. My condition was triggered by a massive dose of gamma radiation. A purely physical catalyst. But his seems to be psychosomatic. His power, this quirk as it's called in Japan, was dormant. It took an extreme emotional event, abject terror, the desperate need to protect his family, to unlock it. Dr. Cho nodded, her eyes on a chart displaying Izuku's brain activity. The energy seems to originate in the cerebellum but draws power from his entire nervous system. It's incredibly dangerous. He's lucky to be alive. He's lucky his body has a corresponding healing factor. Bruce corrected gently. It's a feedback loop. Immense power causes immense damage, which triggers immense healing. It's like having the Hulk, but without the extra body. All that rage and power contained in a normal human frame. He looked at the sleeping boy, a wave of empathy washing over him. He knew what it was like to carry a destructive force inside you, to be afraid of your own strength. To know that a single moment of lost control could shatter the world around you. The key will be control, Bruce murmured, more to himself than to Cho. If he can learn to access a small percentage of that power, to regulate the flow instead of just opening the floodgates, maybe he can use it without destroying himself. He saw a chance here not just to help a child, but to study a phenomenon that mirrored his own curse. Perhaps by understanding Izuku's light, he could gain a better understanding of his own darkness. He would approach it carefully, with all the patience and precision of a scientist who knew, better than anyone, the catastrophic cost of a failed experiment. Natasha Romanoff. Natasha understood silence. She had been raised in it, weaponized by it. She knew that the quietest people were often the ones screaming the loudest on the inside. She did not try to fill Izuku's silence with words like Steve did, or with data like Tony. Instead, she respected it. She recognized the wall he had built around himself because she lived inside a fortress of her own. Her visits were brief and unobtrusive. She would enter his room when no one else was there, a ghost in her own right. She wouldn't speak to him. She would simply perform a small act of care, and then leave. One day, she left a tray on his bedside table. It held a bowl of katsudon, the smell of pork and egg rich and savory, and a small flask of warm green tea. It was the taste of home, a reminder of a life before the screaming and the falling sky. The next day, the tray was empty. Another time, she left a stack of manga. Not the popular, flashy hero titles, but quieter, slice-of-life stories. She placed them on the chair beside his wheelchair without a word and left. A week later, she noticed the bookmark had moved. She was communicating in a language he could understand, the language of action, not words. She was showing him that he was seen, not as a project or a victim, but as a person. She didn't demand his trust or his gratitude. She was simply tending to the fragile, flickering flame of his humanity, giving it space and oxygen, hoping it would one day be strong enough to burn on its own again. One night she stood in the doorway of his room, watching him. He was awake, sitting in his wheelchair by the window, looking up at the stardusted sky. He looked impossibly small and frail against the vastness of the cosmos visible through the reinforced glass. He was a survivor, a victim, an orphan, a weapon. He was so many things, all of them heavy. Natasha knew what it was to be defined by your worst day. She had spent a lifetime trying to outrun the red in her ledger. She hoped, with a fierce, quiet intensity she rarely allowed herself to feel, that this boy would one day learn that he was more than the ashes he had risen from. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, something began to change. After nearly 2 months of absolute silence, Izuku began to move. At night, when the compound was quiet and most of its superhuman occupants were asleep, he would wheel himself out of the med bay. The nurses, under orders from Steve and Natasha, let him. He became the compound's nocturnal ghost. He would navigate the wide, silent hallways, his movements clumsy but determined. The compound was a marvel of modern architecture, all clean lines, polished concrete, and vast panes of glass. It felt less like a home and more like a museum. He was its sole, silent patron. He would wheel himself to the edge of the communal living area and watch from the shadows. He saw Steve Rogers sketching in a notepad, his brow furrowed in concentration. He saw Sam Wilson and James Rhodes playing a ridiculously intense game of chess. He saw Wanda Maximoff sitting by herself, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, her eyes distant with a grief that he recognized as a mirror of his own. He would make his way to the hangar bay, the cavernous space housing the Quinjets, their sleek forms like sleeping metal beasts. The air here smelled of ozone and hydraulic fluid. It was the smell of power, of potential, of heroes about to leap into action. He would park his wheelchair outside the glass walls of Tony Stark's lab, watching the billionaire inventor move like a caged tiger amidst his holographic creations, his hands a blur as he manipulated light and data. Sometimes, he saw the designs on the screens, schematics for braces and supports, all designed around a human form that was unmistakably his own. He was an observer, gathering data in the only way he knew how. He was analyzing them. The Avengers. His saviors. His captors. His new, terrifying, and completely unwanted reality. One night, he found his way to a high-level observation deck. The glass walls offered a breathtaking, 180-degree view of the night sky, untainted by city lights. He wheeled himself to the center of the room and just looked. He saw the constellations he knew from his father's telescope. He saw the faint, milky band of the galaxy. He thought about how his parents had promised to take him to a real observatory one day. A fresh wave of grief, sharp and debilitating, washed over him. The wall inside his mind trembled, threatening to collapse. A tear, the first he had shed since waking up, traced a hot path down his cheek. Then another. Soon, his small, broken body was shaking with silent, racking sobs. The dam of his silence had finally broken, not with a roar, but with the quiet, heartbreaking trickle of a child's tears. He didn't know how long he sat there, crying in the dark. But eventually he heard the softest of footsteps behind him. He didn't have to look to know who it was. He'd memorized all of their footfalls on his nightly wanderings. Natasha Romanoff stopped a few feet away. She didn't speak. She didn't approach. She just stood there, a silent witness to his broken heart. After a long time, his sobs subsided, leaving him hollowed out and exhausted. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with his grief, and with her quiet, steadfast presence. He finally turned his wheelchair to face her. In the dim starlight filtering through the glass, he could see her face. Her expression wasn't one of pity. It was one of understanding. Of recognition. His voice, when it finally came, was a raw, scratchy thing, ruined by disuse and sorrow. It was barely a whisper. "It hurts." Natasha gave a slow, solemn nod. Her own voice was just as soft. "I know." It was not a promise that it would get better. It was not a platitude about time healing all wounds. It was just a simple, profound acknowledgement of his pain. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in weeks. For the first time since the sky fell, Izuku Midoriya didn't feel entirely alone. The ghost still lingered, but for the briefest of moments, he felt the faint, warm pulse of his own heart, beating in time with the steady rhythm of the compound around him. It was a start. The silence that had been Izuku's shield for so long had fractured, but it had not vanished. It had changed its nature. It was no longer the absolute, crushing void of a mind in full retreat, but a quieter, more thoughtful space. Words, when he chose to use them, were deliberate and few, each one costing him a measure of energy he was still struggling to reclaim. His days took on a new, grueling rhythm, a cycle of physical therapy, medical observation, and long, quiet hours spent staring out the window. The physical therapists were kind but firm, pushing his atrophied muscles to their limits. They worked to reclaim the mobility in his left side while his right remained a latticework of advanced polymers and softly glowing medical tech. Every strained push-up against the wall, every painful rotation of his ankle, was a battle fought against the memory of his own power. He was rebuilding a body that had been broken not by an enemy, but by a catastrophic miracle from within. The ghost of the compound was becoming more solid, more present. He would join the others in the communal living area now, sitting in his wheelchair at the edge of the room, a silent observer. He would watch them, these titans who had plucked him from the ashes of his life, and wonder where he fit. He was a piece from a different puzzle, all sharp edges and a picture that didn't match, forced into a space he didn't understand. It was during one of these periods of quiet observation that the question began to form, a persistent, gnawing inquiry that echoed in the hollow spaces of his grief. It was a question aimed at the man who had found him, the man who sat with him in the silence, the man who represented the very ideal of heroism that Izuku had once worshipped from afar. He found his opportunity one crisp autumn morning. The air was cool, and the trees that ringed the compound were a riot of red and gold. Steve Rogers was outside on a small stone patio, a sketchbook open on his lap, meticulously drawing the landscape. There was a profound peace about him in these moments, a stillness that seemed at odds with the soldier he was. Izuku wheeled himself out through the automatic doors, the quiet whir of his chair's motor the only sound. He stopped a few feet away, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair. He watched Steve's pencil move for a full minute, the graphite scratching softly against the paper. He was tracing the outline of a particularly brilliant maple tree, capturing the way the morning sun filtered through its leaves. Steve didn't look up, but he stopped drawing. "Morning, Izuku." Izuku's throat was dry. He swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet air. He had rehearsed the words in his head 1,000 times, but they still felt heavy, clumsy on his tongue. "Captain Rogers?" he began, his voice barely a whisper. Steve finally looked up, his blue eyes clear and direct. He offered a small, gentle smile. "Steve is fine, son." Izuku nodded, his gaze dropping to his own lap. He traced the seam on his sweatpants with a trembling finger. "Steve!" he corrected himself softly. He took a breath. "I have a question." Steve closed his sketchbook and gave the boy his full, undivided attention. "Anything." The question came out in a rush, a torrent of doubt and confusion that he could no longer contain. "Why? Why did you save me? When everyone else was gone, and I was broken. Why me?" It was the cry of a survivor, steeped in a guilt so deep it felt like a part of his own DNA. Why was I the one to live? What makes me so special that I deserve to be saved when my parents didn't? Steve's expression softened with a deep, painful empathy. He didn't offer a simple, heroic platitude. He didn't say, "It's what we do." He looked at Izuku, truly looked at him, and saw past the broken body and the haunted eyes. "When I first got to that alley," Steve began, his voice low and steady, I saw the aftermath of a massive energy discharge. I saw a destroyed Ultron sentry. And I saw you. My first thought was that you were a victim, just another casualty caught in the blast. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. But then I pieced it together. The old woman we found a block away, the one you helped. She told us, through a translator, what happened. She told us about a family, a man, a woman, and their son, who stopped in the middle of all that chaos, who risked everything to save her. A stranger. Izuku's eyes widened, glistening with unshed tears. He remembered her, the feel of her frail arm over his shoulders. I didn't save you because of the power you have, Izuku, Steve said, his voice resonating with unshakable conviction. I saved you because of who you are. In the worst moment of your life, when everyone else was running for their own survival, you and your parents ran towards the danger to help someone. You were a hero long before that power ever made an appearance. I saw a spark in you, son. The same spark I saw in good soldiers back in the war, the same spark I see in the best of us here. It's the instinct to stand up, to protect, to put others before yourself. That's why I saved you. That spark is the rarest, most valuable thing in the universe. It's worth saving every single time. The words struck Izuku with the force of a physical blow. All this time, he had been defined by the terrible, destructive power that had awakened inside him. He had seen himself as its vessel, its victim, a monster whose first act was to fail his family. But Steve saw something else. He saw a choice. An action. He saw the boy who had tried to use a piece of rebar as a lever. The purpose he had been searching for wasn't in the power. The power was just a tool. The purpose was in the spark. A single tear escaped and rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. For the first time, it wasn't a tear of grief, but of something fragile and new, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. The transition from the open air of the patio to the cold, clinical heart of Tony Stark's laboratory was a jarring one. If Steve's world was one of heart and conviction, Tony's was a realm of data, logic, and a relentless pursuit of quantifiable truth. Izuku sat in his wheelchair in the center of the lab. He was surrounded by a constellation of shimmering blue holograms. A three-dimensional, rotating model of his own body hung in the air beside him, strands of green light pulsing through its nervous system. Dr. Banner stood beside him, his presence calm and reassuring, while Tony Stark paced in front of a massive data screen, a whirlwind of restless energy. "All right, kid. Brace yourself for the science," Tony announced, gesturing dramatically at the holographic display. "And try to keep up. We've been decoding what's going on under your hood, and it's a doozy." He tapped a command into the air, and the hologram zoomed in, showing a single, stylized muscle fiber. Tiny particles of green energy swirled into it. "Best we can figure," Tony began, launching into an explanation with the rapid-fire cadence of a man whose mind worked faster than his mouth, "is that your body is a biological capacitor. A battery. On a cellular level, you're constantly, passively absorbing and stockpiling ambient kinetic energy. It's a tiny amount, barely detectable, but it adds up. Every step you take, every time your heart beats, every breath you draw, it's all being converted and stored." Bruce Banner stepped forward, picking up the explanation in his more measured, academic tone. "We believe this ability, this quirk, is a stockpiling power. It builds energy over a lifetime, or, potentially, over generations. The genetic markers are unique. It's possible this energy has been passed down, accumulating from one person to the next." The concept was staggering. A power passed through his family line? A legacy from people he'd never known? It made a strange, painful kind of sense. "In Sokovia," Bruce continued gently, "you experienced an event of extreme emotional and physical distress. That event acted as a trigger, bypassing all the normal biological safeguards. You didn't just tap into the power, you blew the dam. You discharged everything your body had stored in one single, uncontrolled burst." Tony swiped his hand, and a graph appeared, showing a terrifyingly sharp spike. 1.21 gigawatts, to be precise, he said, whistling softly. "Great Scott, you hit that robot with enough juice to power a time-traveling DeLorean. The problem is, your body isn't a DeLorean. It's not built for that kind of output. The energy you released created a kinetic backlash that essentially flash-cooked your own tissues and shattered your bones. Think of it like running a Formula One engine in a go-kart. The power is incredible, but the chassis tears itself to pieces. Izuku stared at the spike on the graph. That was him. That was the moment his life ended and a new, terrifying one began. He looked down at his braced arm, at the faint, lightning-shaped scars that still patterned his skin. The evidence was irrefutable. So, what does that mean? Izuku asked, his voice quiet. Can I not use it? Is it just a bomb inside me? No. Yes. It's complicated, Tony said, running a hand through his hair. Using it at 100% like you did? Yeah, that's a suicide mission. Every single time, you'd be a one-punch-and-done hero, leaving a very impressive corpse. But, he brought up a new hologram. It was a complex schematic of a metallic bracer, designed to fit over an arm. But if we can't upgrade the chassis, we can reinforce it. I've been designing these shock-absorbent braces, made from a vibranium-infused alloy. They won't solve the problem, but they'll help mitigate the damage, distribute the shock, and keep your bones from turning into dust. Think of them as an external skeleton. A roll cage for your limbs. Bruce placed a comforting hand on Izuku's shoulder. The real key, Izuku, won't be in the tech. It will be in your control. The Hulk, the other guy, he's all or nothing. That's what I've been trying to manage for years. Your power is similar. It wants to be all or nothing. Your job, if you choose to accept it, is to learn how to bargain with it. To learn how to release not a flood, but a trickle. 1%. 5%. To let just enough out to be effective, without destroying yourself in the process. Izuku's mind, the analytical mind that had filled 13 notebooks with hero data, finally kicked into gear. The grief and trauma had clouded it for so long, but this was a problem. A variable, an equation to be solved, stockpiled energy. Percentage-based output. Bodily reinforcement. Emotional trigger. He looked at the two brilliant scientists before him, at the incredible technology surrounding him, and then at his own broken body. He remembered Steve's words. I saw a spark in you. This power wasn't a curse. It was a challenge. It was the most complex, most dangerous puzzle he had ever encountered, and his own body was the board. Okay, he said, a new resolve hardening his voice. Okay. How do we start? The training room was designated TR-04, but Tony had nicknamed it the box. It was a perfect cube, 20 meters on each side, with walls made of a matte gray, impact-absorbing material. The air hummed with the silent energy of a dozen different sensors, and an observation booth with a one-way mirror ran the length of one wall. It was sterile, intimidating, and perfectly safe. Izuku sat in his wheelchair in the center of the room. He wasn't wearing his casts or braces. For this test, they needed a pure baseline. Dr. Cho had used the regeneration cradle to heal him to a point where he was stable, though his right side was still weak and aching. Bruce was in the room with him, monitoring a set of vitals on a portable data pad. Behind the one-way mirror, Tony, Steve, and Natasha watched. All right, Izuku, Bruce said, his voice calm and even, like a meditation guide. The goal here is not a show of force. We are not trying to punch anything. We're not even trying to stand up. The goal is simply to connect. To feel that energy inside you, and to draw the smallest possible amount to one specific point. He held up his own hand. Focus on your left index finger. It's a part of your body that's fully healed, with no residual trauma. Try to remember what you felt in that alley. Not the pain. Not the fear. The feeling of the power itself. The energy. Izuku closed his eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The air in the box was cool and still. He tried to clear his mind, to reach inside himself for that wellspring of power. But there was nothing, just the phantom ache in his bones and the memory of loss. I can't feel anything, he whispered, his eyes still closed. That's because you're trying to access it logically, Bruce said patiently. It's not a logical power. It's tied to your emotional state. In Sokovia, it was a fight-or-flight response. Your will to protect was so strong it shattered your internal locks. You need to find that key again. The key. The trigger. Izuku knew what it was. He didn't want to touch it. He had spent months building a fortress around that memory, around that pain. To access his power, he had to willingly walk back into the heart of his own personal hell. He took another breath. He let the fortress crumble. He pictured the alley. The damp chill of the air. The smell of dust and fear. He saw the Ultron sentry, its blue optics cold and merciless. He saw the cannon on its arm begin to glow. He saw his mother's face, etched with terror. He saw his father moving to shield them, a final, futile act of love. No, the word was a silent scream in his mind. The grief, the rage, the profound, soul-crushing unfairness of it all came rushing back, a tidal wave of emotion he had held at bay for months. He felt it then, a familiar, terrifying warmth spreading from his core, a hum in his blood, like a power line about to snap. That's it, Bruce said softly, his eyes on the date pad. Bioenergy levels are rising. Keep your focus, Izuku. Just the finger. A tiny fraction. Izuku channeled the storm inside him. He funneled the grief, the anger, the love, all of it, into a single, infinitesimally small point. He imagined it as a river of green light, and he was trying to divert just one single drop into his left index finger. He opened his eyes and looked at his hand. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint, emerald tracery, like a tiny lightning bolt, flickered over the skin of his fingertip. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. The air around his hand crackled, and a sound like a single grain of popping corn echoed in the silent room. Snap! A bolt of white-hot agony shot up his arm. He cried out, snatching his hand back as if he'd been burned. He looked down at his finger. It was already swelling, bent at a horrifyingly unnatural angle. He had broken it. With less than 1,000% of his power, he had shattered the bone in his own finger. In the observation booth, Tony cursed under his breath, his eyes glued to a monitor displaying the energy output. 0.001%. Not even that. And it still did that. Steve's jaw was tight. He looked at the boy, now cradling his hand, his face a mask of pain and frustration. This was going to be harder than any of them had imagined. Natasha remained silent, her gaze analytical. She wasn't watching the monitors. She was watching Izuku. She saw the pain, yes, but she also saw the look in his eyes after the initial shock passed. It wasn't despair. It was a fierce, burning determination. He had failed, but he had also succeeded. He had touched the lightning, and now he knew it could be touched. Back in the box, Bruce was already at his side, gently examining the broken finger. "It's okay," he said soothingly. "This was expected. It's not a failure, Izuku. It's a data point. It's the first step." Izuku nodded, biting his lip to keep from crying out. The physical pain was sharp, but the sting of failure was worse. He had hurt himself again. He felt useless. A broken boy with a broken power. He sat on the edge of a bed in the med bay, his newly set and splinted finger resting on a pillow. The mini cradle had already done most of the work, the bone knitted back together, but the phantom ache remained. Steve Rogers sat in the chair beside him, the same one he had occupied so often during Izuku's long silence. "That wasn't a failure today, son," Steve said, breaking the quiet between them. "The first time I held this shield." He gestured with a nod of his head to the iconic weapon that was never far from his side. "I couldn't even throw it straight. It clattered to the floor half the time. Every skill takes practice. Yours is just a little more dangerous than most." Izuku stared at his splinted finger. "It's not just dangerous, Steve. It's destructive. Maybe I'm not meant to use it. Maybe I'm just supposed to live with it. Is that what you want?" Steve asked gently. "To live your life afraid of what's inside you?" Izuku didn't answer for a long time. He thought of his parents. He thought of their last moments, not of their deaths, but of their final, heroic act. They had chosen to help. They had chosen to act. To live his life in fear would be to betray their memory. It would be to let that spark they had passed on to him die out. "No," he finally whispered. I want to use it. I want to make sure. I want to make sure no one ever has to feel the way I did. I want to save people. So they can go home to their families, so they don't have to be alone. He looked up at Steve, his green eyes, so often clouded with grief, now shining with a fierce, unwavering purpose. I want to be a hero. Like you? Like All Might. The name of his childhood idol felt strange on his tongue here, in this world of real heroes and real consequences. Steve smiled, a genuine, warm expression. You've already got the heart for it, Izuku. That's the part you can't teach. The rest is just training. He paused. A hero needs a name. Have you ever thought of one? A faint, sad smile touched Izuku's lips. It was the first time any of them had seen him smile. I have, he said. A long time ago. My whole life, actually. I always knew what my hero name would be. He looked down at his hands, at the one good and the one newly broken. My name is Izuku. In Japanese, the characters can be read a different way. A friend of mine, a long time ago, used to read it as Deku. Steve frowned slightly. Deku? What does that mean? It means useless, Izuku said, the word holding no sting for him now. It was just a fact, a piece of his history. Because I was quirkless. I couldn't do anything. I was just a useless Deku who could only dream about being a hero. He took a breath, and his gaze became firm, meeting Steve's without wavering. But I'm not going to let it mean that anymore. Another friend, she told me it sounded like the word for you can do it. It's all a matter of perspective. He held up his splinted finger, a symbol of his failure and his first step. I'm going to take that name. I'm going to make it my own. Every time I hear it, it will be a reminder of where I started, a reminder that I can overcome anything. I'll turn useless into a name that gives people hope. When they see me, I want them to think, Deku is here. We can do it. We're going to be okay. Steve Rogers looked at the 14-year-old boy before him, an orphan forged in tragedy, a survivor wrestling with a power that could kill him, a child who had every right to be consumed by bitterness and despair. And in that child, he saw a will of iron. He saw a boy taking the cruelest words of his past and forging them into a shield. He felt a swell of pride so immense it almost took his breath away. This was the spark. This was what he had seen in that dusty, blood-soaked alley. He stood up and placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder, his grip firm and steady. All right, Deku, he said, the name feeling natural, powerful. Let's get to work. The compound, once a sterile and intimidating cage, began to transform into something else. It became a crucible. It became a school. It became, in the most unexpected and complicated of ways, a home. Izuku Midoriya, now answering to the name Deku in training, had declared his intent, and the Avengers, in their disparate ways, answered the call. His education as a hero began not with a single teacher, but with a faculty of legends, each bringing their own unique, and often conflicting, philosophies to his development. His days fell into a structured, demanding routine that pushed every limit of his body and mind. Mornings were for physical conditioning and control. Afternoons were for academics, strategy, and technical analysis. Evenings were for recovery, study, and the quiet, often unspoken lessons of learning to live as a part of this strange, superpowered family. The ghost of the compound was fading, replaced by a focused, ferociously determined young man who attacked his training with the same meticulous intensity he had once reserved for his notebooks. The notebooks themselves made a triumphant return. Natasha, on a rare supply run into the city, had returned with a crisp, new stack of them, identical to the ones he had lost in Sokovia. She'd left them on his bed without a word. That night, for the first time in months, Izuku had picked up a pencil, the fresh scent of paper and graphite a comforting balm. He opened to the first page and, with a hand that was now steady, wrote, Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 14. This volume, however, was different. It wasn't filled with the fanish adoration of a distant observer. It was the field manual of a student, an apprentice. The pages began to fill with sketches and notes, but now they were first-hand observations, detailed analyses of his own mentors. With Steve, the foundation of a hero. Deku's mornings began at dawn on the sprawling training grounds of the compound. Rain or shine, Captain America was there, waiting for him. These sessions were the bedrock of his physical training, a foundation built on discipline, endurance, and the hard-won wisdom of a soldier from another time. Power isn't the same as strength, Deku, Steve would say, his voice calm and steady as they jogged the perimeter of the compound, the cool morning air biting at their lungs. Your power is a tidal wave. It's spectacular, but it's indiscriminate. Strength is knowing how to control that wave. It's knowing when to be a tidal wave, and when to be a single, focused drop of water. Their training was brutally practical. Steve pushed Deku's physical limits relentlessly. Miles of running to build stamina, hours of calisthenics, push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, to forge a body that could withstand the recoil of his own quirk. But the core of their work was in combat. Steve taught him the fundamentals of boxing, of Krav Maga, of a dozen different fighting styles he had absorbed over his long life. He was a patient, exacting teacher. He would correct Deku's footwork with a gentle nudge of his boot, adjust the angle of his elbow with a light touch. No, not like that, he'd say, stopping Deku mid-punch. You're putting all the force in your arm. That's how you break it. The power comes from your core, from your legs. Your arm is just a delivery system. The most crucial lessons, however, were about control. Steve knew he couldn't teach Deku how to handle the colossal, internal force of his quirk, but he could teach him how to manage his own body, the vessel for that force. He had Deku practice his punches and kicks at quarter speed, then half speed, focusing on perfect form and the sensation of every muscle contracting. It's about intent, Steve explained during a break, handing Deku a water bottle. Right now, when you try to access your power, you're thinking about the big, emotional trigger. The rage. The grief. That's why it's explosive. We need to retrain that impulse. I want you to focus on something else. Focus on the mechanics. The rotation of your hip, the extension of your shoulder. Channel the energy into the movement, not the impact. It was a breakthrough. By shifting his mental focus from the emotional trigger to the physical act, Deku found he could exert a finer degree of control. It was still wildly inconsistent. One moment, he would execute a perfect jab, his fist stopping an inch from a punching bag with no energy release at all. The next, he would try the same thing, and a flicker of green energy would erupt, sending a painful jolt up his arm and leaving a scorched mark on the bag. One of their most memorable sessions involved Steve's shield. He stood 50 yards away from Deku on a training field. All right, Deku, Steve called out. Your objective is simple. Hit the shield. Deku stared at the small, circular target. It seemed impossible. He took a deep breath, focusing on the memory of anger and fear. He channeled it into his arm, felt the familiar, dangerous warmth spread through him. He threw a punch at the air in front of him. The result was a messy, uncontrolled blast of force. It wasn't a focus beam. It was more like a shotgun blast of kinetic energy. It kicked up a huge cloud of dirt and grass 20 feet wide, but it dissipated long before it reached Steve, who stood unmoved, the shield still held steady. The recoil sent Deku stumbling back, his arm screaming in protest, though thankfully not broken. Again, Steve said calmly. For an hour, Deku tried. He tried focusing his anger. He tried focusing his grief. Each attempt ended the same way, a wide, messy blast and a jolt of pain. He was panting, sweat stinging his eyes, his frustration mounting. I can't do it! He finally yelled, his voice cracking. I can't control it. It's just chaos. That's because you're still trying to use it like a club, Steve called back, his voice cutting through Deku's frustration. You're throwing a tantrum at the air. Stop trying to obliterate the target. Stop thinking about the power at all. Just throw a punch. A perfect punch. Like we practiced. Focus on your form. Deku gritted his teeth. It sounded insane. How could he not think about the power? It was a roaring bonfire inside him. But he was exhausted, and his own way wasn't working. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and pushed the emotions away. He visualized the movement Steve had drilled into him hundreds of times. The pivot of his back foot. The twist of his hips. The snap of his shoulder. He opened his eyes, fixed his gaze on the small, distant star on Steve's shield, and threw the punch. This time, it was different. There was no explosive sound, no wild burst of energy. Instead, a tight, compressed bolt of pale green air shot from his fist. It looked like a miniature cannonball made of wind. It flew straight and true, and struck Steve's shield with a sharp, resonant clang that echoed across the field. The impact was strong enough to make Steve take a single, solid step back. The recoil in Deku's arm was minimal, a dull thrum rather than a sharp shock. Deku stared at his hand, then at Steve, his mouth agape. He had done it. Steve lowered his shield, a broad, proud smile on his face. "That's it, son," he said, his voice ringing with approval. "That's strength. Not a tidal wave. A single, focused drop." That night, Deku's notebook entry on Captain America was filled with frantic sketches of body mechanics and trajectories. He wrote, "Captain America's greatest strength isn't his super soldier serum, it's his control and his character. He teaches that heroism is not defined by the scale of one's power, but by the precision of its application and the worthiness of its purpose." With Natasha, the art of the ghost. If Steve's training was about building a foundation, Natasha Romanoff's was about deconstruction. She taught him how to be unseen, unheard, and how to master the one battlefield more dangerous than any other, his own mind. Their sessions took place in the Glass House, a sprawling, multi-level training area filled with obstacles, pressure plates, and laser grids, designed to test stealth and agility. Here, Deku's nascent power was a liability, not an asset. A single misstep, a flicker of uncontrolled energy, would set off a dozen alarms. "Superpowers make you loud," Natasha told him on their first day, her voice a low murmur as they stood in the shadows of the glass house. "They announce your presence. They make you a target. A real ghost doesn't need to break down a door when he can find the key." She taught him acrobatics, forcing his body to bend and move in ways he never thought possible. He learned to balance, to climb, to fall silently. She was a merciless instructor, often disappearing into the rafters and observing him, her only feedback a soft hiss of sloppy, or too slow, from an unseen corner. But her most profound lessons were about emotional control. Natasha was perhaps the only person in the compound who truly understood the hurricane of trauma and guilt that still raged inside Deku. She had her own storms. One afternoon, during a particularly frustrating session where Deku kept tripping a laser grid, he slammed his fist against the wall in anger. A small crackle of green energy erupted, and the compound's alert system blared for a second before Natasha silenced it from a hidden panel. She dropped from the ceiling, landing as silently as a cat behind him. "Anger is a tool," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "It can be a powerful one. But you are letting it use you. You are a slave to your emotions. To your grief. To your rage. That makes you predictable. That makes you weak." "I'm not weak," Deku shot back, spinning to face her, his eyes blazing. "Aren't you?" she countered, her expression unreadable. "Your power is triggered by your pain. An enemy who knows that owns you. They can make you a bomb and aim you wherever they want. They can make you destroy everything you're trying to protect." Her words hit him harder than any physical blow. She was right. The incident in Lagos, where Wanda's own trauma and fear had led to a catastrophic mistake, was a fresh wound for the entire team. Natasha was warning him that he was on the same path. She led him to the compound's empty dojo. They sat on meditation mats, facing each other. "Close your eyes," she commanded. "Find the anger. The grief. Don't push it away. Don't fight it. Just look at it. Acknowledge it. Give it a name." For an hour, they sat in silence. At first, Deku's mind was a chaotic storm. But guided by Natasha's occasional, quiet prompts, "Breathe. Observe. Do not judge," he began to learn. He learned to separate himself from his emotions. He could feel the rage, hot and sharp, but he could see it as something separate from his core self. He could feel the grief, a cold, heavy stone in his chest, but he could acknowledge its presence without letting it drown him. "These things, they are a part of your story," she told him as the session ended. "They are not the whole story. You decide what to build with them, a prison, or a fortress. Their bond deepened in these quiet moments. They rarely spoke of their pasts, but they didn't need to. They recognized the same haunted look in each other's eyes. Natasha saw in him a chance to guide someone away from the darkness that had almost consumed her. Deku saw in her a survivor, a testament to the fact that one could endure the unimaginable and emerge stronger, sharper, and in control. His notebook entry for Black Widow was less about technique and more about psychology. He sketched her in silhouette, a ghost moving through a laser grid. Black Widow's power is not physical, it is informational and psychological. She controls the battlefield by controlling herself first. To her, emotion is a weapon, to be aimed and fired with cold precision, never to be allowed to backfire. Lesson: the first person a hero must learn to control is himself. With Tony Bruce, the science of a miracle. While Steve and Natasha tempered his body and mind, Tony Stark and Bruce Banner were focused on the miracle itself. Their laboratory became Deku's classroom, a place where the abstract nature of his power was translated into the hard language of science. Okay, Professor Green Jeans and I have been crunching the numbers, Tony announced one afternoon, gesturing for Deku to wheel himself over to a holographic display. And we've come up with a theory. We're calling it focal dot. On the screen was an anatomical model of Deku. Instead of a single, explosive burst of green light from one limb, a thin, faint layer of emerald energy was shown coating the entire body. The problem is output, Bruce explained, pointing to the model. You're trying to channel a river through a garden hose. You break the hose, but what if, instead of opening the floodgate all at once, you diverted a tiny fraction of that river into a network of smaller channels, spreading the pressure across your entire system? The idea, Tony cut in, unable to let anyone else have the last word on his idea, is to constantly run your power at a very low, manageable level. Say, 1%, not concentrated in your fist, but distributed evenly throughout your entire body. Focal. It would give you a baseline of enhanced speed, strength, and agility, without the catastrophic explosive damage to a single limb. It was brilliant. It was a paradigm shift in how Deku viewed his own power. He had been thinking of it as a weapon to be fired. They were proposing he wear it as armor. The practical application was agonizingly difficult. In the box, Deku would spend hours trying to achieve this state. He'd sit in his chair, eyes closed in concentration, trying to spread that trickle of power not just to one finger, but to every finger. To his arms, his legs, his core. The results were messy. He would get it for a split second, his skin faintly glowing, red lines appearing under the surface as his capillaries struggled with the energy, and then he'd lose control. One arm would flare with too much power, sending a jolt of pain through him. His legs would twitch uncontrollably. It's like trying to fill 1,000,000 tiny teacups with a fire hose. He'd groan in frustration, but Tony and Bruce were relentless. They provided him with biofeedback monitors, devices that would beep with a steady rhythm when he was maintaining the state correctly, and buzz erratically when he lost control. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to make progress. He could hold it for 1 second. Then 2. Then 5. During these sessions, Deku's analytical mind flourished. He filled his notebook with charts, graphs, and observations about his own physiology. He proposed modifications to Tony's brace designs, suggesting a network system that could provide real-time feedback on energy distribution. Tony, to Deku's shock and delight, actually listened, incorporating his ideas into the next prototype. Stark and Banner approach heroism as an engineering problem, Deku wrote, sketching a diagram of the focal energy flow. To them, a superpower is a system to be understood, optimized, and controlled. They believe that with enough data and the right technology, any problem can be solved. Their lesson is that a hero's mind is his greatest weapon. Understanding your own power is the first step to mastering it. With Wanda, the empathy of survivors, perhaps the most important bond Deku formed was not with a teacher, but with a fellow student of grief. Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, was an island in the compound, much like Deku himself had been. Her power was immense, beautiful, and terrifyingly tied to her emotions. She was the other survivor of Sokovia, a fact that connected them on a level no one else could ever understand. They found each other in the quiet spaces of the compound, the library late at night, a secluded garden, the empty communal kitchen. Their conversations were rarely about training or powers. They spoke of Sokovia. Not of the battle, but of the home it had once been. Wanda would describe the taste of her mother's paprikash. Deku would tell her about the little cafe where he, his mother, and his father had their last happy meal. They were two halves of the same scarred coin. He was an orphan of the battle. She was an orphan who had, for a time, fought on the other side. She carried the guilt of her choices. He carried the guilt of his power's first awakening. "Does it ever stop hurting?" he asked her one evening. They were sitting on a balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and violet. Wanda hugged her knees to her chest, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "No," she said, her voice soft and tinged with her Sokovian accent. "But it changes. It becomes a part of you, like a room in your house you don't always go into. But you know it's there." She looked at him. Her eyes, which so often swirled with red energy, were clear and filled with a profound empathy. "The power, it is tied to that room. To the pain. I see it in you, too. When you use it, you go back there, don't you?" Deku nodded silently. "Vision, he tells me that the pain is not the source of the power, but a key that unlocks the door." Wanda continued, a small, sad smile on her lips. "He says we must learn to build other keys. Keys of joy, of peace, of love. So we are not always using the one that cuts our hand every time we turn it." It was the most poetic and insightful explanation of his struggle he had ever heard. From Steve, he learned discipline. From Natasha, control. From Tony and Bruce, understanding. But from Wanda, he learned empathy. He learned that his pain did not make him a monster, it made him human. And that his power, born of that pain, did not have to be a weapon of vengeance. It could be a tool of compassion. They began to help each other. When Wanda would be overwhelmed by her grief, her powers causing the lights to flicker and the objects in the room to tremble, Deku would sit with her. He wouldn't offer advice. He would just talk to her about his mother's smile, about his father's pride, anchoring her to good memories. In turn, when Deku would grow frustrated and reckless in his training, his power flaring dangerously, Wanda would use her own abilities to gently soothe the storm inside his mind, her calming presence a balm on his frayed nerves. They were two broken people, leaning on each other, finding in their shared trauma a fragile, but powerful, kind of healing. They were the Sokovian legacy, and they would choose what that legacy would mean. "Wanda understands," was all Deku wrote on her page in his notebook. Below it, he drew two small, flickering flames, side by side in the darkness, each one making the other burn a little brighter. Months turned into a year. The boy who had arrived at the compound shattered and silent was gone. In his place stood a young man, still lean, but with the wiry strength of a trained fighter. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a fire of fierce determination. He could hold a 5% full cowl for nearly a minute, his body wreathed in green lightning, every movement a blur of controlled power. He could clear the glass house in under 90 seconds without tripping a single sensor. He could debate quantum mechanics with Banner and point out flaws in Stark's propulsion theories. He was no longer just a survivor. He was no longer just a project. He was Deku, the protege of the Avengers, a hero in the making, forged in the fires of an unparalleled tragedy and tempered by the hands of legends. He was ready for the next step. The air in the mission briefing room hummed with a quiet, professional tension. It was a familiar atmosphere for the assembled Avengers, the calm before the controlled storm of a tactical operation. For Izuku Midoriya, however, the air felt electric, each hum of the holographic projectors and soft beep of the tactical displays a thrum of nervous anticipation that resonated deep in his bones. He sat at the vast, circular table, his back ramrod straight, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to still their trembling. He was 15 now. A year of relentless, all-consuming training had chiseled away the last of his boyish softness, replacing it with the lean, coiled muscle of an athlete. He was taller, his shoulders broader, but the most significant change was in his eyes. The haunted, vacant look was a distant memory, replaced by a sharp, analytical focus that missed nothing. He had spent a year as a student. Today, he was being given the chance to be a recruit. Steve Rogers stood at the head of the room, a holographic map of a decommissioned shipyard in Estonia shimmering in the air beside him. "All right, let's run it one more time," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. His eyes swept over the team, Natasha Romanoff, her expression as placid and unreadable as ever, and Sam Wilson, who gave Izuku a subtle, encouraging nod from across the table. "Intel from our sources in Eastern Europe confirms it," Steve continued, tapping the display. A series of satellite images and grainy surveillance photos appeared. "A Hydra splinter cell, led by a former SHIELD scientist named Dr. Eris Thorne, has taken over this shipyard. Thorne was an expert in alien technology reverse engineering. We believe he's been using his old research to weaponize Chitauri tech recovered after the Battle of New York." Images of strange, hybrid weapons flashed on the screen. Rifles fused with glowing blue Chitauri power sources, grenades that pulsed with an unsettling energy. "Thorne's buyers are arriving in 36 hours," Natasha added, her voice a low, cool counterpoint to Steve's. "The deal goes down, and these weapons are scattered to every black market from here to Macau. We move in tonight, under the cover of a coastal storm. The objective is simple: secure the technology, capture Thorne, and dismantle his operation. This is a surgical strike, in and out before they know what hit them." Sam Wilson leaned forward, his focus sharp. "What are we looking at for hostiles?" "Thorne has a private army of about 30 mercs," Steve answered, expanding a schematic of the shipyard's main warehouse. "Well armed with conventional weapons, but a handful of them have been equipped with this new Chitauri tech. They'll be our primary concern. Expect energy pulse rifles and enhanced explosives." This was it. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. It was a relatively low-level threat, a far cry from an alien invasion or a genocidal AI, but to him, it felt like the most important battle in the history of the world. It was his final exam. Steve's gaze finally settled on him. The captain's expression was serious, but underpinned by a deep, unwavering confidence that did more to soothe Izuku's nerves than any platitude could have. "Deku," Steve said, and the hero name felt heavier, more real, in the context of this briefing. "You're with Falcon and Black Widow. You'll be Team Alpha. Your entry point is the roof. You'll provide overwatch while Sam conducts aerial recon. Once he gives the all-clear, you'll descend and work your way to the primary lab on the 3rd floor to secure Thorne's research data. I'll lead Team Bravo and hit the main floor, drawing the bulk of their attention. This is a stealth and data retrieval op for you, not a brawl. Your job is to stay quiet, stay fast, and stay out of sight. Am I clear?" "Yes, sir." "Crystal clear," Izuku replied, his voice coming out steadier than he expected. He had run the simulation in his head 100 times. He knew the layout of the warehouse, the patrol routes of the guards, the specs of the tech they were after. His mind was ready. The only question was whether his body, and his power, were. "Good," Steve said with a firm nod. "Gear up. Wheels up in 30, the briefing ended. As the others filed out, Izuku remained in his chair for a moment, taking a deep, centering breath. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Sam Wilson smiling down at him. "You ready for this, kid?" Sam asked, his tone light and easy. "I think so," Izuku said honestly. "I'm nervous." "Good," Sam replied, giving his shoulder a friendly squeeze. "Nervous means you're paying attention. The day you're not nervous before a mission is the day you get sloppy. Just stick to the plan. We've got your back." The sentiment was simple, but it meant the world to Izuku. He wasn't just the Avengers project anymore. He was part of a team. They had his back. It was his job to prove he deserved to be there to have theirs. The armory at the Avengers compound was a cathedral of technological warfare. Racks of state-of-the-art weaponry stood alongside display cases holding iconic gear: Captain America's shield, Hawkeye's bows, Black Widow's gauntlets. Today, however, Izuku's attention was fixed on a single, open locker. Inside, hanging on a mannequin, was his first suit. It was not a bright, flashy hero costume. There was no cape, no dramatic flair. It was a product of Tony Stark's pragmatism and military-grade design philosophy. The suit was a two-tone, dark forest green and matte black, made from a high-tensile, bullet-resistant polymer. Reinforced plates covered his chest, back, and shoulders, designed to stop small arms fire and shrapnel. The boots were reinforced with steel, and the gloves had knuckle dusters for close-quarters combat. But the most important features were the ones designed specifically for him. Gleaming on the forearms and lower legs of the suit were the prototypes of Tony's designs, refined with Izuku's own feedback, the full cowl support braces. They were sleek, articulated pieces of metal, a dark gunmetal gray with thin, recessed lines that glowed with a soft green light when active, monitoring his energy output. They were a physical manifestation of Tony's penance and Bruce's science, designed to be the roll cage for his limbs. Hanging on a hook beside the suit was a mask. It was a simple, practical affair, a half-cowl that covered his lower face and neck, with a built-in respirator and a secure comms link. A stylized, angular design that vaguely resembled a grinning mouth was etched onto the respirator plate, a subtle, perhaps unintentional, nod to his idol, All Might. Tony Stark leaned against a nearby workbench, a cup of coffee in his hand, observing Izuku with a critical eye. "Well? Don't just stare at it, kid. It's not gonna put itself on." Izuku reached out and ran a hand over the smooth, cool material of the chest plate. It felt real. Solid. He looked at Tony, his gratitude too immense for words. "Thank you, Mr. Stark," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Tony waved a dismissive hand, though a flicker of something like pride softened his usually guarded expression. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me if you bring it back in one piece. The braces are networked to FRIDY. They'll give us real-time telemetry on your power usage. Try to keep it under 10%. Anything more than that and the system will start screaming at me. Try not to give me an aneurysm, alright?" "I'll do my best," Izuku promised, a small, determined smile on his face. He suited up. The process was methodical, each piece clicking into place with satisfying precision. The suit was snug, flexible, moving with him like a second skin. As he clipped the final brace onto his forearm, he caught his reflection in a polished chrome panel. He didn't see the orphaned boy from Sokovia. He didn't see the ghost of the compound. He saw a soldier. A hero in training. He saw Deku. He pulled the mask over his face, the respirator clicking into place. The world became a filtered, tactical overlay. The soft hiss of the respirator was the only sound, a steady rhythm to his own breathing. He was ready. The flight to Estonia was a blur of darkness, and the roar of the Quinjet's engines. The storm Natasha had predicted was rolling in off the Baltic Sea, a curtain of thick, gray clouds and driving rain that provided perfect cover for their approach. Izuku sat strapped into his seat, running through the mission plan for the 10th time. He could feel the low, steady hum of his own power, a consciously maintained 1% full cowl that made his senses feel sharper, his reflexes faster. Green lightning, so faint it was almost invisible, flickered over his new suit. "All right, Alpha Team, listen up." Sam's voice crackled in his ear, cutting through the engine noise. They were all on a private comms channel. "We're 30 seconds out from the drop point. I'll be your eyes in the sky. Deku, you stick to Nat like glue. No heroics, no improvising. We go by the book." "Got it, got it," Izuku replied, his voice slightly distorted by the mask's vocoder. "And kid," Natasha's voice added, smooth as silk, "breathe. You're holding your breath." Izuku realized she was right. He forced himself to take a slow, deep breath, the filtered air cool in his lungs. He gave her a grateful nod. She was seated across from him, looking completely relaxed, as if she were settling in to watch a movie. Her calmness was both intimidating and incredibly reassuring. The Quinjet's rear ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a maelstrom of wind and rain. Below them, shrouded in mist and darkness, was the sprawling, skeletal form of the shipyard. "Go time," Sam said. With a final check of his EXO-7 Falcon wings, he launched himself out of the jet, a dark shape instantly swallowed by the storm. "Our turn," Natasha said, standing up. She clipped a grapnel line to her belt. She looked at Izuku. "Stay close." Izuku clipped his own line and followed her to the edge of the ramp. The wind tore at him, a physical force that threatened to throw him off balance. He anchored himself, bending his knees, the 1% full cowl providing a subtle enhancement to his stability. He looked down at the rain-slicked roof of the warehouse, a dizzying 100 feet below. Natasha gave him a final, sharp look, then simply stepped off the ramp, rappelling into the darkness with practiced, silent grace. Izuku's heart leaped into his throat. He took one last breath and followed her into the storm. The descent was fast and jarring. The grapnel lines slowed him, but the wind whipped him from side to side. He used his feet to brace against the corrugated metal wall of the warehouse, his reinforced boots finding purchase. He landed on the roof beside Natasha a few seconds later, his landing a little harder than hers, but quiet. He immediately crouched, scanning the rooftop, his senses on high alert. "I'm in position." Sam's voice came through the comms. "I've got eyes on the perimeter guards. No signs of alarm. Roof is clear. You're good to find an entry point." Natasha moved like a shadow, her feet making no sound on the wet metal. She led him to a large skylight, its glass thick and reinforced. She produced a small, circular device from her utility belt and attached it to the glass. "Sonic cutter," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It'll vibrate the glass to its resonant frequency, making it brittle. Minimal noise." A low hum, almost too high-pitched for the human ear to detect, emanated from the device. After a few seconds, a perfect circle of glass cracked with a soft tink. Natasha carefully lifted the section out and set it aside. The way was open. She pointed down into the darkness of the warehouse below, then pointed to herself, then to him, and then gave a thumbs up. The signal was clear. "I go first, then you follow." "Okay?" Izuku gave a sharp nod. She slipped through the opening without a sound, disappearing into the blackness. Izuku waited, his heart pounding for her signal. A few seconds later, his comms crackled. "Clear. Come on down." He took a breath and lowered himself through the skylight. He was in the high rafters of the warehouse, a dizzying web of steel beams and catwalks. The main floor below was brightly lit, a hive of activity. Mercenaries patrolled the stacks of shipping containers, and in the center of the vast space, he could see a group of men gathered around a crate, examining a Chitauri rifle. Natasha was already moving, a black shape against the dark steel. He followed, his movements careful and deliberate. This was Natasha's world, the world of stealth and shadows. His power was a liability here. He focused on keeping his full cowl at a steady 1%, just enough to enhance his balance and agility, but not enough to emit a telltale glow. "All right, Alpha Team, I'm marking the lab for you," Sam reported. A schematic of the building appeared in the corner of Izuku's vision, a small heads-up display built into his mask. A room on the third floor of the adjoining office block glowed red. "Looks like 3 guards on that floor. Standard patrol pattern." They reached the access door leading from the rafters into the office block. Natasha pulled a small electronic lockpick from her belt and went to work. The lock clicked open in seconds. They slipped inside. The hallway was dimly lit by emergency lighting. It smelled of stale coffee and mildew. They moved silently, pressing themselves into alcoves as a pair of guards strolled past, their conversation echoing in the quiet hall. Izuku's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. This was real. Those were real guns. A mistake here wouldn't mean a reprimand from Steve. It would mean a bullet. They reached the lab. The door was heavy steel, with a high-tech keypad. Natasha began to work on it, her fingers a blur. Izuku took up a covering position, his eyes scanning the corridor. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching. Fast. Not a patrol. Someone was coming directly for them. He held up a hand, a silent signal. Natasha glanced back, her eyes sharp, and immediately flattened herself against the wall, drawing one of her pistols. A single guard rounded the corner, a bulky man with a shaved head and a cruel-looking scar on his face. He saw them. His eyes widened in surprise, and his hand immediately went to the rifle slung over his shoulder. There was no time for stealth. No time for a plan. Before Natasha could even raise her pistol, Izuku moved. He didn't think. He reacted. All the hours of training with Steve, all the drills, all the muscle memory, took over. He surged forward, his 1% full cowl giving him a burst of speed that was just slightly superhuman. In the space of a single heartbeat, he closed the 10 feet between them. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't use a flashy move. He executed a perfect, textbook takedown. He slammed the heel of his palm into the man's jaw, snapping his head back. At the same time, he swept the man's legs out from under him. The guard went down hard, his head hitting the concrete floor with a sickening thud. He was out cold before his rifle could even clear his shoulder. Izuku stood over the unconscious form, his chest heaving, adrenaline singing in his veins. Natasha was at his side instantly, her pistol now aimed down the hall. She checked the guard, ensuring he was unconscious, then gave Izuku a look. He couldn't read her expression behind the tactical goggles, but he felt a surge of pride. He had done it. He had followed his training. The lab door beeped and hissed open. "Nice work," Natasha murmured, her voice a low, appreciative hum. "But let's not make a habit of it. Get in." The lab was a mess of wires, dismantled alien technology, and holographic schematics. In the center of the room was a large computer terminal. That was their target. "All right, Deku, you're on lookout," Natasha said, already plugging a device into the terminal. "I need 2 minutes to copy these files." Izuku took a position by the door, peering through its small, wire-reinforced window. His adrenaline was still pumping. He had taken down a hostile. He had been fast, efficient, and controlled. A grin spread across his face beneath his mask. Maybe he was actually good at this. That was when the first mistake happened. Down on the main floor, he saw a flash of red, white, and blue. Team Bravo had made their entrance. Captain America's shield ricocheted off a shipping container, taking down 2 mercs. The shipyard erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed up the stairwell, a sudden, deafening symphony of violence. The firefight was a brilliant, chaotic ballet. He saw Steve move with impossible grace, his shield a seamless extension of his body. He saw the other members of Bravo Team, Elite Shield operatives, engaging the enemy with brutal efficiency. It was mesmerizing. He was watching his teacher, his mentor, in his element, and in that moment of distraction, he failed to notice the second guard coming up the stairs until it was too late. The lab door burst open, slamming into Izuku and sending him stumbling back. A mercenary wearing a heavy tactical vest and holding a Chitauri rifle stood framed in the doorway. The weapon glowed with a malevolent blue light. Natasha spun around, abandoning the download, her pistols already barking. But the merc's armor was enhanced. The bullets sparked harmlessly off his chest plate. He grinned, a cruel, ugly expression, and leveled the rifle at her. Everything slowed down. Izuku saw the barrel of the gun glow brighter. He saw Natasha's eyes widen as she realized her bullets were ineffective. He saw the merc's finger tighten on the trigger. There was no time for a plan. No time for a controlled, 1% takedown. Natasha was going to die. He remembered Steve's words. "I saw a spark in you, the instinct to run towards the danger." He remembered his own promise. "I want to save people." He didn't think. He felt. He reached for the key that Wanda had warned him about, the key of pain and rage and loss. He opened the door to that room in his mind and let the storm out. Detroit Smash! The name of the move was a silent scream in his mind, a tribute to his idol. He threw a punch, not with 1%, or even 5. He felt the braces on his arms strain and groan as he bypassed all his training, all his discipline, and unleashed a raw, untamed torrent of power. The telemetry in Tony's lab would be screaming. He estimated it was 15%. A cannon blast of air erupted from his fist. It was not a focused bolt, but a shockwave of pure, concussive force. It hit the mercenary square in the chest. The man's high-tech armor crumpled like tin foil. He was lifted off his feet and thrown backward out of the lab, slamming into the opposite wall of the hallway with enough force to crack the concrete. The lab itself was devastated. The shockwave blew every piece of equipment off the tables. Wires sparked. The main computer terminal exploded in a shower of glass and electronics. Natasha was thrown back against the far wall, though she had managed to shield her head with her arms. The mission was compromised. The data was lost. And then, the pain hit Izuku. It was a familiar, soul-shattering agony. A white-hot fire raced up his arm. He looked down and saw, to his horror, that the support brace, Tony's marvel of engineering, had been warped and shattered by the sheer force of the recoil. Beneath the twisted metal, the sleeve of his suit was soaked in blood. He could feel the familiar, sickening grinding of shattered bone. His right arm was broken. Badly, he collapsed to one knee, clutching the ruined limb, a strangled cry of pain escaping his lips. Natasha was on her feet in an instant, her professionalism overriding any surprise. "Deku, what did you do?" she demanded, rushing to his side. I had to," he gasped, gritting his teeth against the waves of agony. "He was going to. What the hell was that?" Tony Stark's frantic voice yelled over the comms. "Kid, your vitals just redlined. I'm reading a massive energy spike. What's going on up there, Romanoff?" "We're compromised," Natasha replied, her voice dangerously calm as she helped Izuku to his feet. "Thorn's data is destroyed. Deku is injured. We need to evac." Through the haze of pain, Izuku saw more mercs swarming up the stairwell, drawn by the commotion. But his eyes were fixed on something else. Across the warehouse, on a lower catwalk, he saw a civilian. A woman, a technician by the looks of her lab coat, who had been caught in the crossfire. She was cowering behind a large piece of machinery, and a Hydra agent, one of the few still standing, had spotted her. He wasn't aiming a rifle. He was holding a grenade, one of the enhanced Chitauri models. He pulled the pin. Izuku's blood ran cold. It was happening again. An innocent person trapped. A bomb. A choice. "Nat, civilian!" he yelled, pointing with his good arm. "Catwalk, 3 o'clock!" Natasha's eyes followed his. She cursed under her breath. They were too far away. Steve was pinned down on the main floor. Sam was engaged with mercs on the roof. No one could get to her in time. The Hydra agent grinned and lobbed the grenade. It arced through the air, a small, blinking harbinger of death, and landed right beside the cowering technician. Izuku didn't hesitate. Ignoring the screaming pain in his arm, ignoring Natasha's shout of his name, he ran. He launched himself over the railing of the lab's doorway, landing on the catwalk below with a jarring impact. His 5% full cowl was active now, his body wreathed in green lightning, pushing through the pain. He was a blur of motion. The 3 seconds before the grenade detonated stretched into an eternity. He saw the woman's terrified face. He saw the blinking red light of the grenade. He reached her just as it was about to explode. There was no time to throw it back. No time to get them both clear. He made a choice. The only choice a hero could make. He grabbed the woman and spun, putting his own body between her and the blast. He braced himself, the armored plates on his back his only shield. The grenade detonated. The world dissolved into a cacophony of light and sound. The force of the Chitauri-enhanced explosion was immense. It felt like being hit by a freight train. The back of his suit was shredded, the armor plates vaporized. White-hot shrapnel tore into his back. The force threw him forward, over the woman, his body absorbing the entirety of the blast. He landed in a heap, his ears ringing, his vision swimming with black spots. The pain from his back was a roaring inferno that dwarfed the agony in his arm. He could smell his own suit burning. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. The woman behind him was alive. Shaken, terrified, but alive. He had saved her. He had done it. He had saved someone. The thought was a small, triumphant flicker in a universe of pain. Then he collapsed. The debrief took place in the med bay. Izuku was sitting on the edge of a bed, stripped to the waist. Dr. Cho was quietly tending to the dozen angry red wounds on his back, her brow furrowed in concentration. His right arm was in a heavy-duty cast, the broken bones already being knitted together by a low-level regeneration field. Steve, Tony, Natasha, and Sam stood before him. No one was smiling. The atmosphere was thick with a heavy, disappointed silence that felt worse than any shouting match. Tony was the first to speak, his voice dangerously low. He held up the shattered remains of the support brace. "I told you. I said, try not to give me an aneurysm. What did you do? You ignored your training, you ignored my tech, and you went nuclear. You not only broke your arm, you broke $250,000 of prototype vibranium alloy. And for what? You destroyed the objective. The data on Thorne's entire network, his buyers, everything, gone. I saved Natasha's life, Izuku said, his voice quiet, his gaze fixed on the floor. There were other ways, Natasha said, her voice not angry, but laced with a cold disappointment that cut deeper. 800 other options. You could have disarmed him. You could have used a controlled burst to knock him off balance. You chose the biggest, loudest, most destructive option because it was the easiest. Because you panicked. Then the grenade, Sam added, shaking his head. Jumping in front of a bomb, kid? What were you thinking? We're a team. You're supposed to trust us to do our jobs. If you had just held them off for 2 more seconds, I would have been there. Izuku flinched. He had been so sure he'd done the right thing. He had saved that woman. Wasn't that the whole point? Only Steve remained silent. He looked at Izuku, his expression a complicated mixture of pride, concern, and profound disappointment. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy. You saved 2 lives today, Deku, he said, and Izuku's head snapped up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. You saved Natasha, and you saved that technician. Your instincts were heroic. Your heart is in the right place. That was never in doubt. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over Izuku. But your methods were reckless. You caused an incredible amount of collateral damage. You destroyed our primary objective, and you nearly got yourself killed. Twice. Good intentions don't rebuild labs, Izuku. They don't recover lost intel. And they don't fix the buildings we break. The words were a direct echo of the argument that had been brewing within the team for months. The argument about accountability. About consequences. Being a hero isn't just about having the power to save people, Steve finished, his voice filled with a weary sadness. It's about having the wisdom to know how. And the discipline to do it right. You have a long way to go. He turned and walked out of the med bay, the others following him, leaving Izuku alone with Dr. Cho and the stinging, silent judgment of his own failure. He looked down at his broken arm, at the reflection of his bandaged back in a polished medical instrument. He had saved the day. He had saved the person. But he had failed the mission. He was a hero. And, he was beginning to understand, that was a far more complicated thing than he had ever imagined. The black and white of his notebooks was dissolving into an impossible, unforgiving shade of gray.